Rick Pizzo, Andy Katz alongside. I'm assuming all your holiday shopping is done, your travel is booked, everything is set.
Not at all.
No, good man. Because he's been focused much more on the world of Big Ten basketball. And there have been some interesting developments over the course of this season. Let's start today with the big story and the games that were played on Thursday night. May have seen the bragging rights game, and it was nothing to brag about for Illinois as the Illini go down by more than 20 to Missouri. Better news for Minnesota, Maryland, and Penn State as those three teams pick up wins, though the Gophers had to battle against Chicago State. Much easier for Maryland and Penn State. Andy, let's start with Illinois because there were a lot of expectations. I think some were unrealistic when you started to consider that 86% of the production was gone from last year. But Brad Underwood has made no secret he is not happy with this team's chemistry. He's not happy with their toughness. And I think it really showed last night. This is going to be a tough loss to come back from. Not just a loss, but the way they lost this game to an arch rival.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. As you know, when we're out in the field and we see it with our own eyes, you get sort of pulled in and say, okay, wait a minute, this team's got it together. They certainly can be a contender. And I went to 3 straight Illinois games, okay? Saw them beat Syracuse easily. Syracuse played horribly. Illinois didn't shoot great, but they still won easily, and Coleman Hawkins had a triple-double. Game 2, I'm at Maryland. Game they could have won. Great atmosphere, and they end up losing late to the Terps. They played really well. Terrence Shannon gets the cut over the eye. If that doesn't happen, maybe they win that road game. Next game, we're in New York. They come back to beat Texas, at the time, a top 5 team. And they win in overtime. Great atmosphere. I don't recognize this team. And that was only 16 days ago. You know, since then, the Penn State home loss, they didn't play well against Alabama A&M, and this debacle in St. Louis. I cannot wrap my head around how this team has unraveled so quickly.
The Alabama A&M win, remember, they actually trailed that game by a point with 10 minutes to go and then put their foot on the accelerator. But Brad Underwood blasted this team after the Penn State loss. He blasted this team after Alabama A&M, and there's no surprise that he was very vocal in his displeasure with his team again after the loss to Missouri on Thursday. Quote, "This group doesn't have my footprint yet. Toughness, toughness. You ask anybody in this league, in the Big Ten, about what I am, it's toughness." How many times do we get our ball taken tonight? Just taken. It's toughness, being able to execute, toughness and discipline to be able to guard. I go to that last sentence, to be able to guard. You mentioned the loss to Maryland. It was a track meet, and Maryland won that track meet. You mentioned the loss to Penn State. The Nittany Lions shot the ball so well because Illinois didn't really defend. I think this team can score. Terrence Shannon is a walking bucket. Matt Meyer has been much better as of late. They can score points, but if they're going to let teams score 80, 85, 90, they don't have that kind of explosiveness on a consistent basis to keep pace.
Yeah, and there's a couple things. First off, I think in a weird way we are now actually seeing the loss of Kofi Cockburn, because what Kofi Cockburn did was he ate up space in the middle. Maybe he wasn't great running the floor as well, but defensively, without ever blocking a shot, he was altering shots. So now you take him out. Coleman Hawkins, he's much more of a floater defensively and offensively. He's not your traditional big. Dane Danger had a great start to the year, but then he's kind of faded in terms of minutes and productivity. And so they're missing, I think, something inside.
A presence.
Yes, a presence. And that has reared its ugly head. And then on the perimeter, you know, Matt Meyer at Baylor. Baylor, traditionally, they play some zone, some man, they spread it out, and he was not one of those tougher guards when they had, David Mitchell, and, they've had better, bigger guards. Meyer was their shooter. He wasn't their defender. So now you bring him over, and Terrence Shannon is sort of left alone in that regard. And then they've got young guys like Sky Clark. So the pieces just still haven't fit yet, and to Brad's point, they're not tough.
And I think what Brad is obviously trying to do is he's trying to speak to his team through the media. A lot of coaches do this, and he wasn't done after those comments about toughness following the loss to loss to Missouri. He also said, I think the one thing we've got to do is learn to trust. Trust is the last part of being a really good team. I think that's a fascinating part of this comment. Again, a lot of new faces, but you have to trust what we're doing. Trust is the one thing we don't have. Everybody trying to do their own deal. We do it in practice, but do we trust each other? Right now, no. Again, this is not just an Illinois problem. This is all across the country. This is why I think we've seen more shocking results this year than in years past. I think this transfer portal and the ability to immediately change your roster can be very helpful. I think this is one aspect in which it is very harmful. It becomes so much more difficult to build chemistry with 5 or 6 guys who are brand new to your program as opposed to having a nucleus who have been around for 2, 3, 4 years.
And the best team in the Big Ten right now doesn't really use transfers, Purdue. Obviously every way you build a roster, this roster management is going to be different for every school. But Matt Painter is barely going to ever do it because he's built a culture of getting guys, developing them, and by the way, they like to stay. And it has worked. And we're seeing, you're exactly right. Sometimes you get lucky on the transfers. With Michigan a couple of years ago, Mike Smith, that transfer point guard from Columbia, Ivy League guard steps right in, and it worked. Sometimes it doesn't. And I'm not saying it's not going to work here at Illinois, but the pieces just haven't fit yet. Will they? We'll wait and see. Terrence Shannon also in that news conference last night talked about accountability. And, we know how Brad Underwood felt about his leadership, made a sound after that Penn State game. Yes,
I believe is what it was.
But Shannon was up there next to him last night. So he showed up last night and basically said we need to be more accountable. So if that is true, if that happens, over this break, they played Bethune-Cookman, so they got one more non-conference game that they should win, and then they jump right back in the Big Ten. And by the way, we got to remind everyone, they're 0-2.
I was just going to say, and they better
0-2.
do well at the restart of Big Ten. They are 0-2. You pointed out Purdue, unbeaten as a team that doesn't do much in the transfer portal. Wisconsin, the same. Also 2-0 in the Big Ten through 2 conference games before the restart of conference play. Let's move on to a team that beat Illinois earlier this year in Maryland. They started 9-0, and then they had 3 losses. None of the losses would be considered bad losses in terms of the competition they played, including Tennessee and a UCLA team that I think is remarkably underrated and has a chance to win it all. They get back on track last night. From what you've seen, is this Maryland team ready at this point with the new pieces that they have and some of that returning talent to actually challenge for the Big Ten, or do we still feel like there may be 1 or 2 moments away from getting to that level of a Purdue?
So I thought last night having both these teams play was really interesting for us to juxtapose because Maryland was coming off 3 straight losses to 3 really good teams, including a blowout loss at home to UCLA. And they had time to sort of get everything reset before they played this game against St. Peter's. And clearly what we saw last night was the message was delivered because they came out with great effort. They defended St. Peter's. I know it's not last year's St. Peter's team. They got to the Elite 8, but they only scored 45, and they barely got to 45. Maryland scored well at 75. And he looked to some new faces. Patrick Emilian, who was averaging 1.8 points.
He's been a defensive guy, really.
Yeah, a game, he ends up with 10. So he went to look for a little bit more of an infusion of energy. Jameer Young played better. It just felt like they used that time better than Illinois did from their previous bad loss. I mean, they weren't bad. They played poorly against good teams.
Yeah, they weren't. None of the 3 were bad losses. Yeah, yes. Wisconsin, Tennessee, UCLA.
Right. They played awful against Tennessee, yet came back and then just got blown out by UCLA. But those are 2 teams that could get to the Final Four. And clearly, Maryland, the message was sent. Are they going to win the Big Ten? No. Are they, though, a team that could get to the NCAA tournament, finish in that
Absolutely.
6 to 8 range? Sure.
I love Kevin Willard, too. I think the job that he has done very early, coming in, building that chemistry we've talked about, it doesn't just apply to players, it applies to coaches, too. And he's only been in College Park for a couple of months. I think doing a great job at the start.
One quick thing I just want to add that I thought Kevin Willard did a great job of with the portal is he told Hakeem Hart, Dante Scott, and
the returning vets,
yes,
the guys that expected to get a lot of minutes and points.
I'm going to bring in transfers to complement you.
Yeah, but this is still your team.
Not to replace you.
Right.
Thought that was critical.
That was the right approach to take.
Yes.
I love the approach that Micah Shrewsbury has been taking. I think those who follow college basketball, follow college coaching, believe he is the right guy to get this Penn State team back to where Penn State fans want it to be. Nice win last night. Jalen Pickett, I love to call him a walking bucket. But for some reason, Andy, outside the Big Ten, there doesn't appear to be much respect, much concern for Penn State. I think this is a team that is really dangerous inside the league, even on the road. I think maybe even more so on the road. I think they're a really dangerous team.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. We know how great the home courts are in the Big Ten. Penn State's not one of them. And it's a fair statement. It's never been a great home court in men's basketball, not football, obviously. Obviously an early game in a storm. They did not have a great crowd, and yet they created their own energy. It was a closer game than I think they thought. But you're right. This Penn State team, they almost beat Virginia Tech. They had Clemson beat. Andrew Funk
should have won that game twice.
Yes. So they lose that game in double overtime. So neither one of those are bad losses, but I think the narrative would have changed had they won those games. And then they lose at home to Michigan State, probably the only game that they played poorly in, because they didn't play poorly, obviously, against Virginia Tech or Clemson. So the Michigan State home game, but then for them to turn around on the road and beat Illinois, that spoke volumes to me. And at the beginning of the season, I thought Penn State could be an NCAA tournament team. After those couple losses, thought maybe not. Now I've reset my mind to say, you know what? The way they're playing right now, there's no question they can get to be in position to maybe get a bid.
They're a team that, to me, needs to have a really solid restart. In early Big Ten play in January, they need to go 3-1, maybe 3-2 at the absolute worst to feel like, okay, and obviously it depends on who you beat, where you beat them, but to have a chance, a legitimate chance of being a postseason team.
And Seth Lundy didn't play last night.
Correct.
Hopefully he will come back.
Important cog.
Yes.
About 90 seconds left here, so let's touch on the fourth Big Ten team to play on Thursday, and that was Minnesota. Closer than expected against a not very good Chicago State team. Listen, it's a rebuild for Ben Johnson. That's absolutely true. We don't expect this team to be a postseason contender this year, maybe a couple of years away. So what is Ben Johnson trying to build, at least for the remainder of this year?
Well, to continue to be competitive. I mean, Jamison Battle is still not 100%. That hurt that he was, starting the season on the bench because of injury. Dawson Garcia, getting a fresh start in Minnesota. Those two guys obviously are big-time scorers when they're healthy. They got to get their young guys going because they're going to rely on them. This was a weird game. It got pushed up because of the storm. They're playing a men's and women's doubleheader, and they sort of changed the times of it. Not a good crowd.
It's like a high school setup when that happens.
Everything about it was not normal for, players coming into, and it felt like what Iowa dealt with the other night with Eastern Illinois, or afternoon. Classic before break trap.
I was just going to say, at least Minnesota got the win, because there are other teams in the Big Ten that were big-time favorites that had games moved up that didn't fare so well. Note, biggest upset in the point spread era. I'm sorry, Iowa fans were like, okay, this was 2 days ago. Can't we just move on? It is time for today's big stat, brought to you by Gatorade. You look at the difference from a year ago to now for the Penn State Nittany Lion hockey team, everything, vast improvements, and that is a big reason why the latest USCHO.com poll has Penn State ranked number 5 in the nation. And as we welcome you back to Big Ten Today, it is time now for our edition of The Big Interview. Always great to catch up with Penn State hockey headman Guy Gadowsky, whose team is off to that outstanding 15-5 start. Hey, Guy, I know you'll worry about hockey when you guys get back at it in about 10 days, but right now I know you guys are dealing with some weather as well. How's everything in State College these days?
Well, it's great. There's a lot of great things going on, the weather being not one of them. But other than the weather, you know what? You got to like what's going on here at Penn State.
Certainly like what we've seen from your team on the ice, 15-5 through 20. You didn't suffer a regulation loss until your 12th game of the season. How early on was it, even in preseason skates, that you noticed that this team could be something special?
I think it goes back to last year, actually. I think the team did a lot of work, especially off the ice in terms of culture, and we saw some of that come to fruition. We saw some of the benefits of that happening at the end of last year. I thought we played really, really well in the playoffs, beat a very, very tough and excellent team in Ohio State in the playoffs, and really we just kept on going from there. So it wasn't just the start of the year. I think that the team felt that what they were doing off the ice and the work they put in from a cultural standpoint was going to pay off. And it's nice to see that so far it's happening.
I think those that don't follow Big Ten hockey, maybe casual college hockey fans, would think, well, at 15-5, Penn State has to have a bunch of stat stuffers, a bunch of guys who are in that 25 to 30 point range. That's actually not the fact. You don't have a single player that's averaging a point a game, but you have 10 players who are already in double digits in points. How does that speak to the chemistry and the unselfishness of this particular group?
You know, that's a good point, actually, is that it does speak a lot to the unselfishness, but it's also something that we try to accomplish here. It's a little bit by design. We've always felt that we want a whole team that plays well and plays offensively and gets going, rather than putting all our eggs in a couple baskets. So it's something that we try to do. It doesn't work all the time, but when you have four lines and really three D pairs every night that have the potential to score goals and produce, I mean, it makes you feel good, and it helps exactly what you just said. It helps the unselfish attitude.
I know leadership is obviously always a huge key as well, and this is unique as we work through the COVID extra year and so many teams having guys who could be 23, 24 years of age because of that extra eligibility. Your senior leadership at the top, whether it's Kevin Wall or the two Connors or the guys that you have on the D-line, what are they bringing this team right now?
Well, this couldn't have happened. When I talk about the difference being in terms of the culture and what was started last year, I don't think this could happen without him. In fact, I'm sure it couldn't. And I think, you know, the guy that really has to take a lot of the credit is our captain, Paul DeNaples. And he's unique in the sense that, you know, there's a lot of guys I think can be great captains and great leaders when things are going really well. And there's very few that can be great captains and great leaders when things aren't. And he was a guy that in the last couple of years during COVID, when we had some struggles, like he was a guy that stepped up, not because he wanted to, but because he took the responsibility and did it in such a positive, just such a great way. I mean, he's been really, really important, not only on the ice, obviously he's an excellent player, but off the ice, you know, with really setting the culture and making sure our standards are high. I think he deserves a lot of credit for that.
Guy, a lot of teams can be good at home. Certainly, I think a lot would be if they had your home ice advantage. I still think the best college hockey rink in the entire country at Pagula. But you're also a good road team. You've shown that already. You won at Notre Dame. You won at Minnesota, arguably the toughest place to play inside the Big Ten, out of your barn. You swept Wisconsin in Madison. What's the makeup of this team that makes it a good road team?
You know, we grind. I mean, I think it gets back to the culture a little bit. Just the guys grind. They play together. Like you mentioned, it's not just one or two guys that we rely on. We rely on everybody, and they grind together. And when they're doing that, I think you can win anywhere. You're right. There's extremely difficult places to play and to win here in the Big Ten. I like the reference. I think we're one of them. Our Roar Zone is the best in the nation, not just the Big Ten, and it's really tough. But going on the road, when you have guys that grind together and play for each other, good things usually happen.
You know, I'm not going to talk about your team without talking about goaltending. And when you've had some of your best teams, you've had outstanding goaltending, whether it was Peyton Jones, whether it was Matt Scoff before him. You could name a whole bunch of goaltenders during your really solid years, and every year you had some guy step up. Liam Souliere took over late in the year last year, and this year he's leading a team which leads the Big Ten in goals against per game. What's the biggest step that he's taken, and what are his best qualities?
Yeah, so you're right about that, and I don't think you can win in the Big Ten with good goaltending. I think you need great goaltending, and everybody does. So you need, you know, probably really great goaltending, and we've been fortunate that's what's been happening. I do think that it's a lot of the credit goes to the team, though. It's not just one guy. I think that the whole team is taking responsibility defensively in a different way and much more accountable way. So that's certainly helped. But when you talk about Sully specifically, I mean, he's just such a cool cat. Like when you ask about, you know, what are his attributes, what makes him so good, I really think for him, he's a really good athlete. Like if you look at his numbers in the weight room, he's a bit of a freak athlete, which is I think a necessity now at that position. But just his ability to just be so cool in any situation, like you have no idea if you just focus on him. You don't know if we are losing 10-0 or it's the last few minutes of a 40 save shutout for him. It's just no difference. He's just so cool. He's such a cool cat that I think it's his attitude, not just his play, but his attitude that's been really helpful.
Isn't that change in athleticism amazing? I think most people say, well, maybe it started in kind of the Jonathan Quick with the LA Kings era. I mean, Guy, I remember when I was playing at that position, we were always the last guy in the state. We were the last guy doing the Herbies. We were the least athletic guy on the entire team. That's why they stuck us in goal. It's completely done a 180, hasn't it?
No, it sure has. It's funny, and I remember the same thing. Like you used to put the guys that couldn't skate, you used to put them in goal, and that's not the case now. I mean, Liam is one of our most powerful athletes, and it's the way it is across the board. They're big, solid, quick, explosive athletes, and like I said, in the Big Ten, you can't win with good goaltending. You just can't. You need great goaltending, and fortunately, so far, that's what we're getting.
Yeah, and you certainly need it this year. You look at the strength of the league from top to bottom. Your team in Minnesota inside the top 5. You have Michigan just outside the top 5. You have Michigan State, a surprise to many, just outside the top 10. Ohio State, Notre Dame. That means that 6 out of the 7 are inside the top 20 ranked right now. How do you try to approach it when you get back into the meat of play in January to make sure that your guys understand, listen, you're not going to win every game, and that's okay. You just got to bring it every night.
Yeah, it gets back to the grind factor. I think everybody knows that now. Like, it's just such a tough league. It's so hard, and you can play really, really well and lose in this league, and that's the way it is. And if you're not comfortable with that, it's going to be a long year because it's such a high talent, high octane league that it's fun. I tell you that it's fun to be a part of. It's fun to watch. It's great for development, but boy, it's tough to get points every night. And I think you have to accept that. You have to accept that it's not just a scoreboard that's going to determine how you evaluate your play. Because again, you can play extremely well in this league and lose, and that happens. That happens often because of the great teams in this league. It's just the way it is. But I tell you what, it's great for Big Ten hockey fans. I'll tell you that.
All right, Guy, let me get you out of here on this one. It's a topic that you and I have discussed on multiple occasions, but it seems like the discussion has cooled off a little bit about the need, the desire to get an 8th team, to make travel easier, to make that last weekend of scheduling easier. Has that conversation slowed as much as it seems on the outside, or has it just become less of a hot button issue as time passes with 7 in the league?
No, I mean, I think that if you talk, the majority of the coaches are going to say, yeah, we are absolutely for expansion if it makes sense for our league. Every team in our league is a leader in social media metrics and attendance and atmosphere, et cetera. So we've got a great league. And I think that when you look at, you just mentioned, you look at the success of our league nationally, it's awesome. And so, yeah, if the right team comes along, absolutely, we would love to expand. But, keep in mind that just because you have 8, right now we have a balanced schedule. And I think a lot of the coaches love that. We have a perfect balanced schedule. And with 8 teams coming in, unless you really minimize the number of non-conference games you have, that would change. So there's also negatives to expansion as well as positives. So same thing. If we get the right team, absolutely we're going to do it. But I don't think there's any hurry just to do it, because you look at the success of the Big Ten, we seem to be doing a lot of things right.
Without question. Penn State back in action on December 30th against RIT. Until then, Guy, enjoy the remainder of your break. Merry Christmas to you and yours. Always great to catch up.
Hey, Merry Christmas to you, Rick. Thanks a lot.
Welcome back to Big Ten Today. As usual, the National Wrestling Poll is not just littered, but dominated by the Big Ten. The number 1, 2, 3, and 5 teams in the country in Penn State, Iowa, Ohio State, and Michigan, respectively. And you see the rest of the list. You want the top 25 of the Wrestling Coaches Poll? You just go ahead and take a poll of all the teams inside the Big Ten, because that's basically the exact same thing. And with that, it is time for us to chat some Big Ten wrestling, and no one talks Big Ten wrestling better than Shane Sparks. Shane, this time of the year, most of us are more concerned about the fat guy in the red suit. You're concerned with much more fit guys in tighter one-piece spandex. This is the best time of the year for you.
It's fantastic. I live in Wisconsin. It's around 0. It's been snowing the better part of this week, but I know when it's this kind of weather, it's Big Ten wrestling season. I can't wait to kick things off on Big Ten Network in a couple of weeks. But, of course, before that on BTN Plus, a couple of great events. So, yeah, Rick, this is the perfect time of year if you're a wrestling fan.
Shane, we just showed the national poll. Penn State, number 1. It's where they were for almost all of last year after they took it over from the Hawkeyes just a couple of weeks into the season. Is it Penn State and everybody else right now, or can someone knock the Nittany Lions off a lofty perch right now that's been theirs for a few years?
Yeah, Rick, I think the reality is it is Penn State. I mean, they are so loaded. They've won 9 of the last 11 NCAA contested championships. Big Ten will try to make it 16 consecutive tournaments where a Big Ten team has stood atop the podium. Of course, last year in March, they went 1-2-3 with Penn State, Michigan, and Iowa. This Penn State team is stacked. 4 returning national champions. And like Penn State always does, Rick, they don't rebuild, they reload. They have a few freshmen in this lineup that when it's all said and done could be national champions themselves. They are stacked, and they are definitely the team to beat. This is a phenomenal team. And I think when we look back on this team of Penn State, it could go down as one of the all-time great teams. They are fantastic.
That's an amazing statement. But when you think about guys like RBY and Starachi, Aaron Brooks, I mean, you are talking about guys who have a chance to be among the greatest ever at their respective weight classes. And so everybody else is trying to play catch up. Now, it's interesting because one of those teams trying to play catch up, ranked number 2, the Iowa Hawkeyes, most of the teams inside the Big Ten, Shane, they look this year much like they looked last year because of that extra COVID year. So many guys are back. Iowa is kind of the outlier here because they have a handful of guys who did use up all their eligibility a year ago. What's the state of wrestling in Iowa City right now?
They're still very good. Of course, they're led by Spencer Lee. He'll look to win his 4th national title. Remember, both ACLs repaired last January, so it's less than a year. I think they'll be very careful in how they use them. They got to transfer Real Woods from Stanford at 141. He's an All-American, won a pair of Pac-12 championships at Stanford, wrestled at Montini Catholic. He'll be in the mix for a national title. Of course, Jacob Warner at 197, an NCAA finalist. Big Tony Cassiope at heavyweight. He's been a staple. A guy like Max Mirren. Will this be the year he stands on the podium at 149? But there are some new guys in there. Nelson Brands at 174. At 165, Patrick Kennedy, a kid they're really excited about. He's a 4-time Minnesota State champion from Casson Manorville. So there's some new faces in Iowa, but they still have some really good guys that won a lot of matches in that legendary black singlet.
I do want to get more from you on Spencer Lee. We saw him return to the mat against Iowa State. It was an easy win, and only a major decision by Spencer Lee could be considered underperforming by those who were criticizing, because everybody was wondering, why didn't he get the fall or the tech fall, that he looked tired? Of course he looked tired after not having been in actual wrestling shape. What did you make of his return? What do you expect from him this year?
Rick, you said it best. I mean, when Spencer Lee's up 12-1 and wins 16-5, it's like, man, what's wrong with Spencer Lee? The guy is perhaps the best first-period wrestler in the history of college wrestling. He takes you down, he turns you. The bottom line is, at the end of the match, he won 16-5 in a major decision. But again, keep in mind, 2 ACL repairs, 2 of those, and one of those knees being repaired for the second time. That was last January. No question about it. People are keeping an eye on him. They'll be careful in how they manage him and his workload this season. But Spencer Lee trying to become the 4th ever 4-time national champion. It's never been done by an Iowa wrestler. I mean, this guy is looking to accomplish legendary status, and it's definitely one of the key storylines to pay attention to this college wrestling season.
I think another interesting storyline, the ascension of Ohio State and Michigan, teams that have certainly been there in the past. They are 3 and 5, respectively, right now in the coaches' poll. What are the possibilities, the chances that one of those teams could, if not overtake Penn State, at least threaten to be the second best team in this league at year's end?
I think it's going to be really tough for them. I mean, Michigan lost a ton. When you think about the Wolverines, they lost national champion Nick Suriano, Stefan Micic. They lost Miles Amin, Logan Massa. They lost a ton. They still got some really good wrestlers in that team, but they're definitely some young guys in that lineup they'll look to develop. Ohio State, Rick, up to this point, they've been disappointing to say the least. Now, with that being said, they've had some guys banged up. Patty Gallagher, he was the number 1 recruit in the country a couple of years ago. He's been banged up at 157. Carson Hartslaw at 165. He's had it a little bit rough up to this point. Sammy Sasso's lost a few times. Ohio State definitely has work to do, but in this sport, the reality is you're remembered by what you do in March at the Big Ten championships and at the NCAA championships. So they'll have work to do. I think they can right the ship. Realistically, I believe for a team like Michigan and Ohio State, the goal is to take home a team trophy. Those are the top 4 teams at the national tournament. But the reality is, for Ohio State or Michigan, those 2 teams as an example, and quite frankly, even Iowa, it is going to take a monumental effort to dethrone Penn State. Injuries, of course, are huge. It's the X factor in Division I college wrestling. They happen. So if you're a team like Penn State, I mean, you lose a guy, or God forbid you lose a couple of guys, that'll take this equation and turn it upside down. But if Penn State is healthy and they wrestle the way they do every March, it's just really hard to think of a path for any other team to knock them off.
Well, I got to tell you, Shane, last year you were prescient. You sounded like a genius. I remember early in the year you told me Ryan Deacon of Northwestern hasn't been quite able to get over that national championship hump because there are so many good guys in his division. This is going to be the year. Deacon visited us in studio. You even told him this was going to be the year. He made you look like a smart man when he went out and won the national title. Who is on your mind this year? Which individual Big Ten wrestler have you been thinking about that is maybe ready and poised to take the next step and accomplish something this season that he hasn't yet?
The guy that I really like, but he was a hammer, coming to Penn State, is Greg Kirklead at heavyweight. Now, he's been in that mix of the great heavyweights, but I think this is really his year. I saw him at the NWCA All-Star Classic down in Austin, Texas, wrestling Tony Cassiope. Really controlled that match. Cassiope had beaten him a few times last year, I believe it was. But I think with Gable Steveson out the mix, I think a guy like Greg Kirklead's able to take that next step at heavyweight. Again, he was very good last year. He's an All-American, so it's not like I'm coming out with a guy that's coming out of left field. If you wanted a guy that's maybe ranked 10th or below, Jacob Berglund from Minnesota. He's one of the great stories. He was at the U for, I believe it was 4 years. He never got the starting nod. Last year he did, became an All-American. And at that weight class at 140, what I think that is perhaps the weight class that is the most up in the air. They just don't have those, 2 or 3 dominant guys like a lot of other weight classes. I think 141 is up in the air a little bit. Jacob Berglund could be a guy to watch. He's really good on top. And I really like what he did last year. I think he obviously loves the sport to stick around this long with just getting an opportunity for the first time last year. Keep an eye on Jacob Berglund.
All right, Kirklead, Berglund, I got him written down. That way, the last edition of Big Ten Wrestling and Beyond of this coming season, we can see just how smart you are. Shane Sparks, always great to catch up and have you drop a ton of knowledge on Big Ten Wrestling. Merry Christmas, my friend, and we'll see you for Big Ten Wrestling and Beyond debut on January 9th.
I can't wait. Always great to see you, Rick. You take care.